interesting facts about uranium and plutonium. So let's start with uranium. So uranium is the 92nd element, having an atomic number of 238.03. It also has isotope 235, uranium-239, and even uranium-233 and 241. But that's all you need to know. You don't need to know these ones. You only need to know 238 and 235. But here's the thing. Uranium is often the last element on real periodic tables. And it melts at 1132 Celsius and boils at about 4131 Celsius. Which is nearly the boiling point of goldium. So a piece of goldium would boil at nearly the same temperature. And it turns out, and yes, goldium is not a real element. But here's the thing. It turns out that it's used in nuclear reactors, and it's often the last element used in frequent uses. It turns out that large quantities of uranium are often not meant to be worked with, mostly due to the toxicity and even inhaling/swallowing of it. And because your body's in a fission reactor, you won't gain any calories from it. But it turns out that uranium has 20 billion calories per gram. And yes, it turns out that the reason why they gain calories in BFLA 22 is because their bodies were made to be fission reactors, which means that they can gain calories then. So theoretically, you would gain 6 million pounds if your body was a fission reactor. So if that's the case, you would become extremely fat, up to about 4,000 times fatter than the fattest person in the history of the world. So you would weigh over 2 million kilograms if you did gain calories from it. And because it takes about 35 calories to get 1 pound, this means that you'll gain. So 20 billion calories is about 5.714. Wait, let me stop. Let me fix that mistake. So it's 5.714. Sorry. But it's 5.714 million pounds, which is crazy. Which means that if your body was a fission reactor, I can have it for dinner, you would gain way too much weight. But here's the thing. The reason why uranium is used in nuclear reactors, it's most likely because of its electrical conductivity. No, just kidding. But it is mostly used in that. But we don't know all about uranium, except for the fact that it does have isotopes, and it's so radioactive that it should not be handled in public. This is what every cavity should do. And it turns out that most elements past uranium are not allowed to have regular use. Mostly due to the extreme radioactivity. So all element can be kept sort of safely in homes, only in a glass sample. It turns out that elements past it, like Neptunium, Neptunium and plutonium would be very dangerous to handle, and humans have basically no tolerance to it. It turns out that the only people who can handle these elements with safety in the BFLA universe are surprisingly not as McDavid Oxford in Canada. And surprisingly, 106-year-old Lyrian, it turns out that after she was done inventing a lot, she would work as a nuclear reactor boss, and it turns out that she would work on. And it turns out that in this alternate universe, she worked to create plutonium. But the real inventor was So you only need to know one, but it's Glenn Seaborg. But basically, in alternate universe, 106-year-old Larian and Oxygen Kendra and even Asthma Pup were responsible for the creation of that element. It turns out that even Cone had a slight role, except not because of his young age that he couldn't do much, but mostly because he ultimately knew the mixture dozens of years before. Because it turns out that uranium was actually discovered in 1789, the same year Washington was elected. But here's the thing. It turns out that it's often very dangerous to handle. That would be a neptunium sample, that would be a plutonium sample, but this would be a uranium sample. So it turns out that... So let's move on to plutonium. It turns out that plutonium was discovered by Glenn Seaborg and even Joe Kennedy and a couple of others in 1942. Most likely 1942 or 1941. Wait, let's see. Okay, I did some research and I found out that it was actually around 1940. We don't know all the most about the exact date when it was created, but the most reported one is 1944, but I choose 1940 because it's more believable, and there's a very tiny plutonium sample from about 1942. But basically, it turns out that it's used in nuclear bombs. Well, maybe not now, but it turns out that it had quite a big amount of uses in nuclear bombs, so it was like a massive mushroom cloud. And it turns out that basically how it was used is not very well known. But it was used in bombs, and it's even used in some satellites batteries, I assume. I'm not sure that's true, but I think that's what I heard. I hope I'm not wrong. And it turns out that it's actually one of the most dangerous elements. I think, let me see if that's true. Yes, it is used in satellites, batteries, but it's also used as a heat source. It actually melts at about 640 Celsius. And it boils at either 3,228 or 3232 Celsius. And for all those Americans out there, that is actually about 1185 Fahrenheit, the melting point of plutonium. It's only an estimate, though. So it turns out that plutonium boils at either 5,842 Fahrenheit or 5,839 Fahrenheit. So we nearly got 5858 there, surprisingly. And it turns out that it's actually, and believe it or not, it turns out that it's actually, and here's a fun fact about plutonium, it actually glows an orangish color when oxidizing. Here's what that would look like. It turns out that the plutonium is actually has quite a cool glow. But don't use it, because even though it has uses, don't attempt to use it in many things. You just know it isn't too good, because you just know that using it could be a bad disaster to many people. And even though plutonium has an average half-life of nearly 25,000 years, it turns out that surprisingly, plutonium-44 has the longest half-life, nearing 81 million years. So this makes it long. That makes it That means that if a plutonium sample from the dinosaurs existed 80 million years ago, it would have only lost half of its atoms to decaying. And so, yes, it turns out that surprisingly bigger isotopes are quite less stable. Oh, I forgot to mention there's also plutonium-235. But we know very little about these isotopes. The most we do know about is 238, 239, and even 244 in quite large quantities. However, 244 is only used in periodic tables, but it turns out that 238 and 239 are some of the most used ones. But yes, it turns out that's actually the final element that it's even used very often. It turns out that next we'll talk about americium and californium. And here's a bonus fact about these elements. It turns out that americium is actually used in smoke detectors. However, the quantities are honestly quite small. And it's actually able to detect smoke really well. And it turns out that californium, it's produced in such small quantities that as of the time that newspaper was made, it could cost $60 per microgram, which is actually tiny. So it turns out that if you were to have, at the time that the newspaper's released, if you wanted to have a kilogram, you would have to have $60 billion, which means that only Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett and Elon Musk could buy even remotely big quantities of californium. And yes, it turns out that the amount of it is so small that even just $1 million worth would seem tiny on screen. But goodbye.